January 11th, 1944, over Uscherleben, Germany. The morning sky was a frozen canvas of steel and smoke. Sunlight fractured through a ceiling of thin winter cloud, glinting against hundreds of silver bodies climbing eastward. From below, they looked like metallic fish gliding in formation, shimmering with mechanical grace. The roar came seconds later, a deep, unbroken hum that shook the fields, the barns, the trembling windows of the German countryside. Farmers stopped their plows and looked up. The sound was not thunder. It was the drone of the American flying fortress. High above, inside the cockpits of the Luftwaffe, young German pilots adjusted their oxygen masks and narrowed their eyes. They had seen these bombers before. Slow, predictable, easy targets. They called them fliegende Festungen, flying fortresses, half in mockery, half in respect. And yet that morning, something felt different. Reports came in of bombers still holding tight formation deep beyond where they should have been slaughtered. Rumors spread among the pilots. New fighters, long range, moving with the bombers like shadows. They would soon learn that the sound of the engines below carried something far more dangerous than bombs. It carried the echo of an idea, one that would stretch from the skies of Germany to the conscience of an entire world. 3 years earlier, that same sound, the droning hum of American bombers, had been a distant rumor. In 1942, the United States was new to the air war over Europe. The 8th Air Force had arrived in England full of optimism and swagger, determined to prove that daylight precision bombing could cripple Nazi industry and win the war from above. American planners, led by men like General Ira Eaker and General Hap Arnold, believed in the B-17 Flying Fortress as a symbol of technological and moral superiority. It could fly high, defend itself with machine guns, and drop bombs with surgical accuracy. The bomber was a floating manifestation of American industrial faith that mass production, courage, and innovation could deliver democracy through the clouds. But the Luftwaffe saw things differently. By 1942, German fighter pilots had already faced and broken the best of Europe's air forces. The skies over France, Poland, and the Balkans had fallen to their discipline and engineering. To them, the American airmen were amateurs, men of factories and farms, not of fighter wings. The early missions seemed to prove it. American bomber losses mounted brutally. Over Wilhelmshaven, over Bremen, over the Ruhr, formations were ripped apart by swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The bombers were brave, but bravery alone was not armor. For German pilots, the sight of a B-17 bursting into flame became routine, almost mechanical. They watched them spiral down in slow, helpless arcs, leaving trails of black smoke and drifting parachutes. Inside the German cockpits, the radio chatter carried both pride and disbelief. Noch ein fliegende Festung, wieder getroffen. Another flying fortress, downed again. The hum of the B-17, that deep, slow vibration, became to them the sound of futile persistence. They mocked it, mimicked the teeth of the Reich's veteran aces. But something was shifting, something invisible, logistical, relentless. Across the Atlantic, the same hum echoed inside the cavernous hangars of Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed. Assembly lines pulsed day and night, rivers of aluminum and sweat. In Detroit, engineers and laborers, men and women both, worked by floodlight. The hum of the factory floor mirrored the hum of the bombers themselves, a seamless rhythm connecting Kansas to Cambridge, Chicago to Chelmsford. The war of endurance was turning mechanical. The Germans fought with skill, the Americans fought with production. By late 1943, the American campaign was at a breaking point. The 8th Air Force had suffered catastrophic losses over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Hundreds of bombers lost, thousands of men gone.
the Luftwaffe was winning not by technology, but by geography. German fighters struck the formations as soon as they crossed the channel, harassing them all the way to the target. The last hours of every mission were a nightmare, unprotected bombers plowing toward Berlin and back through a sky filled with predators. Survivors recalled it as the loneliest sound in the world, the sudden empty silence on the radio as the last P-47 turned home, leaving the bombers alone. German pilots knew that moment too. They called it the turning point, the instant when the escort peeled away. Then, they attacked. Major Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's leading aces, later described it bluntly. When the fighters left them, they were ours. And for a time, he was right. But deep in American workshops, another sound was taking shape. A new hum, higher pitched, sleeker, faster. The North American P-51 Mustang had been born out of desperation and collaboration. Originally designed for the British, it evolved into one of the most capable aircraft of the war. With the new Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could climb higher, fly faster, and, most importantly, go farther. In the late months of 1943, a quiet revolution was being bolted together in hangars across Britain. Rows of P-51s stood gleaming, their long noses hinting at a predatory grace. Their pilots, young and restless, trained not as guardians of territory, but as companions of the bomber streams, winged shadows of protection. By early 1944, the Mustangs were ready. The Luftwaffe did not yet understand what was coming. January 1944, the first full-scale Mustang escort missions begin. As the bomber formations crossed into German airspace, the Luftwaffe scrambled in force, confident in the same familiar dance: intercept, scatter, destroy. The German pilots banked and climbed through the mist, their engines roaring with authority. But as they broke through the cloud layers and approached the formation, something unexpected glinted in the sunlight. Small, sleek silhouettes weaving effortlessly between the bomber boxes. At first the Germans thought they were early escorts, perhaps thunderbolts that had wandered too far. Then the radio crackled in disbelief. "Sie gehen nicht zurück, they're not turning back." The Mustangs didn't turn. They kept climbing. They stayed. In that instant, the entire rhythm of the air war shifted. For the first time, the B-17s and B-24s were not alone over Germany. The deep hum of their engines, once a dirge of sacrifice, became a song of defiance. The bombers were no longer prey. They were the spearhead of a combined force that could reach the heart of the Reich. German pilots who dove to attack suddenly found themselves stalked, hunted from behind by planes that shouldn't have been there. The hunter became the hunted. By February 1944, the German pilots were facing a sky that no longer obeyed their expectations. The airspace above Europe, once their hunting ground, had turned hostile. The familiar choreography of interception was breaking down. From the ground, radar stations near Kassel and Braunschweig watched their screens with growing unease. The waves of inbound bombers were as dense as ever, but the smaller, sharper blips of American fighters didn't fade away as they should have. They followed the bombers deeper, then disappeared into the heart of Germany. Reports of downed Focke-Wulfs began to outnumber those of bombers. At first, the Luftwaffe commanders thought the reports were mistakes, but confirmation came fast and brutally. February 20th, 1944, the beginning of Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. The 8th Air Force launched an all-out offensive to crush the German aircraft industry. Day after day, waves of flying fortresses and liberators poured across the continent, escorted all the way to the targets Leipzig, Gotha, Regensburg, Augsburg, by the new P-51 Mustangs. For the German airmen, the shock was profound. Major Walter Dahl, a veteran with over 100 kills, later described those days. "We had ruled the air for so long. Then suddenly, the enemy was everywhere. Above, behind, below. There was no escape. The Mustangs moved like predators bred for a single purpose. They were fast, stable, and deadly in a dive. Their pilots, many of them barely 20, flew with a new kind of confidence. No longer tethered by fuel range, they hunted German fighters relentlessly. The tables had turned. German aces, once accustomed to attacking with impunity, found themselves stalked as they climbed through the contrails. They began to fly lower, more cautiously, knowing that the clear blue sky above might hide a diving Mustang. In combat reports from Jagd,
The German civilians heard it too. They began to call it Der Himmelshammer, the hammer of the sky. Every morning it came, a distant rumble, then the slow crescendo of engines that filled the air before the sirens. People in Berlin, Dresden, Munich, Hamburg, they all came to know that sound. In memoirs written after the war, many described the same sensation, that the sound of the bombers carried more than destruction. It carried inevitability. It was the audible proof that the industrial world had shifted, that the balance of power had changed forever. One Berlin resident, recalling 1944, wrote, "At first we cursed the sound, then we feared it, and finally we accepted it. It was the sound of the end." As the Mustangs escorted bombers deeper into the heart of the Reich, a symbolic reversal had occurred. Where once the Luftwaffe had represented technological superiority and mastery of the skies, now the P-51 embodied that role, not through arrogance, but through the quiet confidence of a system that worked. Its long nose and silver sheen became the new symbol of aerial dominance. Its pilots, though young, carried the weight of an entire ideology on their wings, that democracy, though slow to start, could outbuild, outthink, and outlast tyranny. In the rhythm of its Merlin engine was the pulse of the modern world, smooth, constant, unbreakable. The Mustang became more than an escort. It became a herald, announcing to every soldier, every civilian, every observer that the age of fascist mastery in the air was over. By the spring of 1944, the tide in the air was irreversible. Germany's skies, once the proud domain of its fighter aces, had become a place of exhaustion and dread. The young Luftwaffe pilots climbing into their cockpits each morning knew the odds. They had inherited a war that was no longer winnable. The airfields that once roared with confidence were now hushed places of nervous routine. Mechanics worked with trembling hands, cannibalizing damaged aircraft for parts. The Luftwaffe's fuel reserves were dwindling, each liter of aviation gasoline rationed, each mission measured not only in courage, but in minutes of flight time. And still, the bombers came. The hum began before dawn. It grew slowly, rising over the forests, over the spires of burning cities, until it filled every ear. The sound became omnipresent, like the beating of a mechanical heart above the Reich. For the German people, that hum was both familiar and unbearable. They had once looked skyward with pride as their own fighters dominated Europe. Now they looked up with resignation, knowing that nothing could stop the silver tide above them. In the combat rooms of Jagdgeschwader 300, veteran pilots briefed their recruits. Many of these boys were 18 or 19, barely trained, thrust into the cockpit of an FW-119 or Me-109 and told to defend the fatherland. They listened to the briefings, altitude, heading, attack pattern, with hollow eyes. The older aces knew the truth. Even if they succeeded in breaking through the bombers' defensive rings, the Mustangs would be waiting. The new escort doctrine had evolved into what the Americans called free hunting. The P-51s, having swept away the interceptors, no longer merely guarded the bombers. They roamed deep into German airspace, attacking airfields, trains, anything that moved. One Luftwaffe report from April 1944 read simply, "Enemy fighters are everywhere. They arrive before the bombers. They leave after them." The P-51s had achieved what no Allied aircraft before them could: total air presence. June 1944, D-Day. The greatest armada in history crossed the English Channel. Above it, the sky belonged to the Allies. German resistance was fragmented, scattered, unable to mount coordinated air attacks. The reason was not just numbers, it was exhaustion. Months of endless bomber offensives had bled the Luftwaffe dry. The American strategy of industrial persistence, of breaking not just machines, but morale, had worked. From that moment onward, the Luftwaffe was fighting in its own homeland, in shrinking circles of survival. The Mustangs, meanwhile, extended their patrols ever deeper, past the Rhine, over Leipzig, over Dresden, and finally, to the very heart of Berlin. By early 1945, the sight of the silver-winged Mustangs over Berlin was no longer shocking. They came every day, escorting vast rivers of bombers that now operated almost unchallenged. The capital of the Third Reich lay in ruins, and yet the hum continued. It had become a kind of requiem, the final chorus of industrial warfare. Inside Berlin, civilians described the sound as both dreadful and strangely beautiful. The low, endless vibration of hundreds of engines filled the air like an organ note. It was the soundtrack of inevitability, not of hatred, but of endurance, of the mechanical might that democracy could wield when forced to fight for its life. The Germans who had once dismissed the American bombers as clumsy machines now understood that they represented something entirely different. They were not instruments of individual glory, as the Luftwaffe had been. They were symbols of collective will, of an entire nation mobilized in the name of freedom. In those final months, as the Red Army closed in from the east and the Allies advanced from the west, the Luftwaffe's surviving pilots fought on in a silence of despair. They had once flown for domination. Now they flew simply to delay the end. Adolf Galland later said, "We knew we had lost the war when the Mustangs appeared in Berlin." That statement, echoed in memoirs and interviews long after the war, carried more than military meaning. It was an admission of ideological defeat, a recognition that the balance of the modern world had shifted towards the power of production, cooperation, and endurance. The myth of invincible mastery, of the individual ace against the world, had died in those skies. In its place rose something new, the age of industrial warfare, where the hum of engines replaced the roar of heroism. And yet, for the men who flew in those bombers, the sound was never impersonal. They spoke of it as something alive. Inside the B-17, the vibration filled every part of the body, the floor, the seat, even the teeth. The drone was constant, steady, almost comforting. It drowned out fear. It became the heartbeat of the mission. In letters home, some called it the sound of America. One crewman from the 390th Bomb Group wrote after the war, "When you were up there, surrounded by hundreds of planes, you could feel the engines talking to each other. It was like they were saying, 'We're here. We're together. We'll make it home.'" The same sound that terrified German civilians carried hope for those inside it. It was the hum of faith in their comrades, in their machines, in the cause that drove them. By April 1945, the Mustangs were patrolling over the dying city of Berlin almost unopposed. Smoke rose from every district. The Spree River shimmered beneath a haze of dust and flame. When American pilots looked down, they saw a city that had once been the beating heart of the enemy's power, now reduced to rubble. And yet above it all, the sound of their engines remained pure, unbroken, and strong. The war was ending, but the hum continued. It had transcended the battle. It had become the symbol of what the Allies had fought for: endurance, cooperation, abundance, and the unyielding belief that freedom, though costly, could sustain itself through unity. In the days after Germany's surrender, some Luftwaffe pilots were brought to Allied airfields for debriefing. They stood quietly as Mustangs taxied past them, their polished wings gleaming in the sunlight. One former German pilot reportedly murmured, "So that was the sound we could never silence." It was said without bitterness.
It was said with awe. For years they had mocked that sound, the steady, predictable hum of the American bomber stream. Now they understood it. It was not the sound of arrogance, nor of destruction. It was the sound of determination, of democracy in motion. Epigraph. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The skies fell silent for the first time in years. No contrails, no droning engines, no thunder of flak, just quiet. But for those who had lived through it, on both sides, the memory of that sound never left. The hum of the bombers, once feared and hated, became part of the collective memory of an age. It was the sound of an industrial symphony, one built not on heroism alone, but on faith in unity, in purpose, in the belief that ordinary men and women working together could move mountains, even through the sky. In every generation since then, that hum has echoed in another form, in the rhythm of machines, in the whisper of engines, in the endless pulse of collective effort. The Luftwaffe's arrogance had died not by humiliation, but by revelation. The understanding that the true power of a nation lies not in the skill of the few, but in the strength of the many. And so when we look back at those gray mornings over Europe, when the bombers flew in tight formation and the Mustangs danced among them, we hear more than the sound of war. We hear the sound of endurance,